thanks to the Victoria EV Association for inviting BC Ferries to give a bit of an update. So today we want to talk about BC Ferries vessel electrification ambition. A couple of comments just on the slide. When we talk about electrification, Glenn already mentioned that we have a couple of hybrid vessels, but really what we're talking about today, or what I would like to talk about, is our ambition to move to a fully electric vessel, or maybe a few vessels over the coming years, where we'll be able to recharge from from the grid, just like many of you can do with your EVs. The other key word that I want to highlight here is ambition. So some of these ideas that I'm going to talk about coming up are covered by plans that BC Ferries has. Some of them are still things that we're talking about in the what if kind of context, and some of this is personal opinion that I'm going to give you as well. So the disclaimer up front is that not everything I am going to say today is fully endorsed BC Ferries policy, but I think I'm on safe ground to talk about these things that we want to talk about. As Glenn mentioned, my official job is Executive Director Shipbuilding, which means I'm responsible for all of the new construction of new ships that get built for BC Ferries. But a part of my job also is to oversee our further vessel electrification program. So I'll start with just a quick introduction on BC Ferries. I expect that everyone who lives anywhere remotely close to Victoria is familiar with BC Ferries. We are, in fact, one of the larger ferry operators in the world, and there's a few statistics on the slide. We're operating 39 vessels now, ranging in size from those that you can see here, which are the Spirit of BC and the Spirit of Vancouver Island, about to pass each other in active pass. And then we have right down to some very small ones, such as that runs between maybe Mill Bay across the inlet there, the Klitza. So if you can go online and you can Google BC Ferries Clean Futures Plan, you can actually find this document. So I said some of what we're doing is actually plans, and we do have a plan to reduce the carbon emissions, our carbon footprint as a fleet. So you can read it. It's still fairly high level. It's fairly aspirational, and it focuses on 5 things that we can do to really make improvements in how we reduce our carbon footprint. But one of those things is electrification. And again, in the context of vessel electrification, we're talking more about how we can draw energy from the grid, from clean BC hydro electricity to fuel our vessels. Let's start by looking at the Island class vessels. So you can see here a picture of Island Aurora, one of the 6 Island class ships that we have and that have come into service just in the last couple of years. So BC Ferries has just gone through a phase of building these 6 ships. The first 2, Island Discovery, Island Aurora, they were built sort of in 2018, 2019, and they entered service in 2020. And they work pretty well. So we ordered 4 more of those, which we built really during the pandemic. And the last 4 vessels, Island Nogales, Coluta, Quiguis, and Guaris, all kind of were delivered in 2022, and they came into service later in 22 and in 23. You may have seen them. They don't sail out of Victoria, but they were in Point Hope when they were originally delivered. So you saw these maybe downtown Victoria at one point, and then now on runs up and down the coast. So these were our first real experience going with a sort of a diesel battery hybrid configuration. So they have 2 diesel engines on board that provide all of the energy. But they also have an 800 kilowatt hour battery installed, which is designed primarily to enable us to run the engines at their most efficient condition all of the time. And we use them for what we call a peak shaving or a spinning reserve. So peak shaving, you can imagine, is just making sure that our engines run at a nice, steady, smooth RPM all of the time. And spinning reserve means, we have a backup there that if the engine suddenly fails for any reason while the ship is underway, we can immediately draw power from the batteries to keep the propellers turning. Notice on the bottom bullet there that we have a phase 3 of these ships under consideration. Okay, so Island class electrification. We have a plan coming together, and what we need to do is seek approval from the BC Ferries Services Board, our board of directors, and the BC Ferries Commissioner, who's the government's representative who provides oversight of our plans. And what we want to do is start to electrify 4 of these vessels. So specifically, we want to look at two routes between Nanaimo and Gabriola Island, and then between Campbell River and Quadra Island. And on each of those two routes, we're running two of these island class vessels. So we want to convert them from their current diesel electric configuration to basically install more batteries and allow them to run as battery electric ships. We'd also have to do upgrades at the terminals. So we need to bring the grid to the berth where the ship comes in, and then we need to come up with some kind of a charging connection or a plug that would now allow us, basically after every crossing, we'd be able to plug in the ship while we load and unload the cars and the people, recharge the batteries, and then sail back the way we came. So the timeline for doing that is basically now until about 2026. So at the stage we're at now, I said we're seeking the approvals from the board. We'll be speaking with our board in June and again in August. We hope to get approval to proceed with this plan. I want to talk a little bit about the battery systems that we have on these ships. So, what we're showing here is really the idea that you can take a single cell, it's just a small lithium-ion battery, and we start to stack them up to create modules, and then we stack up the modules to create packs or racks, and then we add those packs up to create a system of batteries. And so that's how we start to build up the large energy storage that we need for the ships. So in the marine context, and specifically on the Island class, we're using a company called Corvus. So to show you what it's like, that's the cell. It's about the size of a computer keyboard, roughly speaking. And we don't actually see that when you look at the battery on the ship, because it's been built up into a module that looks something like this, which is maybe about the size of an old desktop computer. And then you put those into the rack to create the pack of batteries, and then we start to rack the packs together to create these battery modules. And in principle, these things are really infinitely expandable. So as many cells as you want, you can put them together, and as many racks as you can create a system here. So as I mentioned, the Island class has got an 800 kilowatt hour battery already, but we want to increase that to about a 2000 kilowatt hour or 2 megawatt hour battery in order to be able to run those ships fully electric without having to run the diesels at all. One of the things we worry about on ships all the time is fires. And so this shows what the system looks like when all of the battery modules have been removed. You can see at the back, there's all of these small circles here. Each one of those is an extraction system. So if there's ever a fire inside the battery, or what we call a thermal runway, if the battery overheats and starts to catch fire, then all of the exhaust from that comes out through this tube you can see on the left-hand side and keeps everything completely safe. Everything is controlled by a module so that our chief engineers, who are keeping watch on the system all the time, can monitor the health of the battery system, look for bad cells, which would allow them to shut down a rack, or make sure that everything is charging and discharging properly. So that's the Island class. The reality we face with ships is they tend to draw a lot of energy. So it takes quite a bit of energy to move a heavy ship through the water. And the reality is that as great as the batteries are, diesel is readily available and it's very handy. So we could fill a ship with diesel once and then sail it for an entire week. Whereas a battery pack, the same energy content as the one jerry can of fuel that you can see here, really takes up about 1.5 tons of weight on the ship. And weight is important for us always, because it impacts the ship design, it impacts the stability, it impacts the amount of cars we can carry. So we're really trying to struggle to find out how we can optimize our battery pack and compete with the real energy efficiencies of older fuel sources, more conventional fuel sources. But we're working on that. Okay, I want to talk now about our new major vessel project. So this is a project for ships that haven't been built yet, but we're looking at replacing some of our older vessels with newer ones. And that gives us an opportunity to consider whether it might be possible to do something really exciting and electrify those as well. So the general scope for the new major vessel, or the NMV, we have 6 legacy vessels, and you can see them here. And chances are many of you have been on board some of these ships. They service the main routes between Vancouver Island and Metro Vancouver, or maybe between North Vancouver and the Sunshine Coast. And they're all getting quite old and they're due for retirement. And our plan is to replace these 6 with identical vessels. So we're going to design and build a new ship, and we're going to build probably 7 of them, because we think the capacity requirements are such that we're going to need an extra ship to carry all of the commercial traffic and the vehicles that need to move around the South Coast. But we've set ourselves a strategic objective of having 0 emissions vessels for these new ones. And you'll notice I've put 0 emissions in quotes here, because we haven't actually defined, or we hadn't initially defined, what does that mean? What does 0 emissions mean to us? To kind of put this into perspective for BC Ferries, we on an annual basis, and I think this is our 2022 emissions here, the company is still putting out something above 300,000 tons of carbon or carbon equivalent every year. And in the grand scheme of things, that's not a huge amount when you consider the province's total greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, even within the transport section, it's only about 1.2% of the total emissions. But it's still, 300,000 tons is a fairly large amount that's going into the atmosphere every year, and we'd like to reduce that. To look at that a little more discreetly, you can see here how we've broken that amount down by routes. And you can see, for example, that Route 1, which is our main route that goes between Sawasan and Schwartz Bay, just that route, just the ships on that route will account for 27% of the company's entire emissions over a year, right? And Route 30 will count for another 20%. Route 2 counts for another almost 20%, 17% here. And Route 3 is the other one that we're looking at. So when you add all of those up, the new major vessels will replace ships, which currently account for about 68% of our total company's carbon emissions. So coming back to what did we mean by 0 emissions, when we sat down at the beginning of this project and we decided what strategic objectives we wanted to reach, it was pretty quick within BC Ferries, within the management side, that we decided we needed to pursue a 0 emissions target. And then we had to figure out what that actually meant to us. So we needed a definition. We report our emissions according to the provincial standards. So we have to report every year how much greenhouse gas emissions we put. So we decided the least we should do is to reduce that amount on our baseline on the routes that we're operating by 75%. But we also look at, the way we report our energy use emissions, which we sometimes call the tank to wake emissions, as opposed to the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, which would be from the well to wake, if that makes sense to people who understand the analogy there with ships. And so when we talk about 0 emissions, we have to report energy use emissions, but corporately, we want to look at the full life cycle picture and make sure we're not just pushing out a 0 emissions vessel while we're somehow creating a bunch of additional emissions by going to some weird fuel source that produces emissions to produce a clean fuel, if you know what I mean. So the company's looking at it from both ways, and we want to basically make a major reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions. This is a way that we can illustrate that. So this graph, what you can see at the left-hand side, at the left-hand column, those gray bars represent 100% of BC Ferries corporate emissions on any given year. And these green sections across the top represent the impact of different initiatives or different ideas that we have, and each one represents emissions that we would not produce, or a way to reduce these total emissions. And if we were to introduce the major vessels and operate them with the same fuel source that we're using now, that would be one of those green lines. However, if we can get that 0 emissions major vessel as we've just defined it, you can see there's a very significant reduction that gets us much closer to a 0 emissions future. Now, there's still some work that we would have to do on the rest of the fleet and our other operations, but I guess the message there is that if we don't achieve a 0 emissions new major vessel, then we're never going to achieve a 0 emissions operation. Okay, a couple more things for me. I think everyone's familiar with BC Ferries, but this shows the major routes that the major vessel is going to replace. So Route 1, Route 2, Route 3, and Route 30. And there's some statistics in this table that shows the approximate duration of a trip, a one-way trip on any of those routes. And if you assume that we spend about 30 minutes in the berth at each end, loading and unloading, you can see that a round trip from departure say from Shorts Bay to Tsawwassen, turn around, back to Shorts Bay, and ready to go again would take about 4 hours. But that's just the time duration. What we have done now, we've done quite a bit of modeling with the new major vessel to see how much energy it would actually take to operate those round trip routes. So for example, on Route 1 between Tsawwassen and Shorts Bay, we have a distance that we have to cross of 50 nautical miles. And so we're going to need, we figure, at least 26 megawatt hours of energy consumed in order to move the ship on that route round trip. Or if you break it down in a one-way trip, it would be about half of that, obviously. So to put that all into context, we did a bit of Googling here to come up with some representative values. But a typical electric car, it depends on what the car is, but you might find a battery size of about 60 kilowatt hours, and with a weight of that battery of about 500 kilograms. And if you went to a level 3 charger, which is anything above 25 kilowatts, you can do a fast charge on that. Okay, so we need to do a fast charge, for example, on our fully electrified ships, because we don't want to change the length of time we have in the berth. We have to stay on our routes and our schedules, so we need fast charging. So if you look at, for example, the Island class, if we follow through with our ambitions, that battery size is going to grow to about 2,000 kilowatt hours. That's 40 tons of batteries on board the ship, which is fairly significant. The weight of the entire vessel is about 1,400 tons. And then in order to charge it quickly in that 10 minutes we have, we're looking at about 3,500 kilowatts as charge power. So that's a pretty high power charger. Now, if you look to the new major vessel, and note my disclaimer, that's just a sketch there. So the ship we actually build might look nothing like that. But that's a 170-meter vessel that's going to weigh over 10,000 tons. And to make those trips with those energies that we just talked about on the previous slide, we're going to need something like 60,000 kilowatt hours or maybe 70,000 kilowatt hours of installed battery to be able to do that as a fully electric vessel. And I mentioned we're going to have 7 vessels. So that's potentially, half a gigawatt hour of batteries that we're going to have to find and put on these ships. So Glenn mentioned at the beginning, I heard him say that in 2021, there was 1,000 EVs in Victoria. You counted 1,000 EVs. If you took all of the batteries of all of those EVs and you put them on one ship, would be about where we need to be. The charge power on that to do a fast charge in the 30 minutes we have alongside could be somewhere around 30 megawatts of charge power, which is significantly greater than the level 3 chargers that you need for your fast charging on the Tesla. So it just shows you the size and complexity become much more challenging. However, I think the encouraging thing for us, and what I find exciting about this program, is that we are thinking about it and we're talking about it, and we're talking with BC Hydro, and we're starting to do some really interesting studies to see just how feasible it might be. So I can't guarantee that we'll be able to do this, but I can tell you from BC Ferries' perspective, we're really going to look hard at trying to get this thing done and see what it's going to take to get there. So it should be an interesting time over the next 2 or 3 years while we really investigate this and see if there's anything we can do to solve the electrification problem. So I think that's the end of my slides. I'm going to stop there, and I'll see if there was any questions.